Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. Translated from the Norwegian by Charles Archer. Book 2. The Mistress of Huseby. Part 3. Erland Nicolausson. Chapter 1. Ranfrid Ivarsdatter lived not full 2 years after her husband's death. She died early in the winter of 1332. It is a long way from Hamar to Skaun, so that they heard nothing of her death at Huseby till she had lain in her grave more than a month. But at Whitsuntide the next year Simon Anderson came to them. There was one thing and another to be talked over between the kinsfolk concerning Ranfrid's inheritance. Kristin Lavransdatter owned Jorengard now, and it was settled that Simon should hold the charge of her lands and goods and draw her farmers to account. He had managed his mother-in-law's estates in the Dale while she had dwelled at Hamar. Just at this time Erland had much trouble and vexation over certain cases that had come up in his wardenship. The autumn before, Huntjov, the farmer of Forbregd in Uppdal, had slain a neighbour of his for calling his wife a trollwoman. The parish folk brought the slayer bound to the warden, and Erland had him shut up in a loft. But when the cold grew fierce in the winter time, he let the man go about loose among his followers. Huntjov had been with Erland in Margeigren in the north, and had done manful service there. So when Erland sent in letters touching Huntjov's case, praying that he be given grace to abide at home till his case was judged, he set the man in the fairest light, and as Alf Halderson went surety that Huntjov would be present in due time at the Orkdal Thing, Erland let the man go home for the Yule holidays. But from home he and his wife set out to visit the rest housekeeper in Dribdal. He was a kinsman of theirs, and on that journey they disappeared. Erland believed that they had lost their lives in the great storm that had raged about that time, but many folk said they had run away. The warden's people might whistle for them now. And then new matters were brought up against the runaways, that Huntjov had killed a man some years before, away in the hills, and buried his body in a scree, a man that he thought had slashed his mare on the rump. And it came out clearly that the wife had dealt in witchcraft. Next, the Uppdal priest and the archbishop's commissary set to work to search and sift all these rumours of witchcraft, and this led to sorry things coming out about the way folks held by their Christian faith in many parts of the Orkdala country. 'Twas most in the outlying parishes like Rennebu and Uppdalskog, but the case of one old man from Budvik too was brought before the archbishop's court at Nidaros. And in this Erland showed so little zeal that there was much talk of it. It was the old Carl Arn, who had lived down by the lake below Huseby, and must well nigh be reckoned as one of Erland's housefolk. He had dealt in runes and spells, and there was talk of some images in his hut which folk said he had used to sacrifice to. But nothing of this kind was found after his death. Erland himself and Ulf Halderson had been with them, 'twas known, when he died, and doubtless they had made away with both one thing and another before the priest came, people said. And when folk came to think of it, had not Erland's own mother's sister been charged with witchcraft, whoredom, and husband-murder? Though Lady Arsild Gautsdatter was too crafty and slippery, and no doubt besides had had too many mighty friends, for nothing could be proved against her. And at the same time people called to mind that Erland in his youth had lived in sadly unchristian fashion, and had set at naught the ban of the church. The end of all this was that the archbishop summoned Erland Nicolausson to come and confer with him at Nidaros. Simon went with his brother-in-law into the city. He was to fetch his sister's son from Runheim, for it was meant that the boy should go back with him to the Dale and be with his mother for a while. It was but a week from the time set for the Froster thing, and the city was full of people. When the brothers-in-law came to the archbishop's palace and were shown into the hall of audience, a number of crossed friars were there, and some laymen of standing. Among them the lagmand of the Froster thing, Harald Nicolausson, Olaf Hermansson, lagmand of Nidaros, Sir Guttorm Helgason, warden of Jämtland, and also Arni Valdsen, who at once came up to Simon Dar and greeted him heartily. Arn drew Simon apart with him into a window nook, and they sat down there. Simon was somewhat ill at ease. He had not met the other since he had been at Ranheim 10 years before, and though the Ranheim folk had then welcomed him most fairly, his visit there on such an errand had left a sore spot in his mind. Whilst Arn was bragging of young Chevald, Simon sat watching his brother-in-law. Erland stood talking with the treasurer, whose name was Sir Bard Peterson, but who was not of kin to the Hesnaes house. One could not have said that Erland's bearing lacked due courtesy, yet he was exceeding free and unabashed as he stood there talking with the old nobleman, swaying a little back and forth, with his hands laid together behind his back. As was mostly his fashion, he was clad in dark colours, but most richly. Violet cotardi sitting close to his body and slashed up the sides, black tippet, with hood thrown back to show the grey silk lining, a silver-mounted belt, and long red boots that were laced tight round the calves and set off the man's slender, shapely legs and feet. In the sharp light from the glass windows of the hall, it was plain enough to see that the hair at Erland Nicolausson's temples was not a little sprinkled with grey. Round his mouth and beneath the eyes, the fine sunburned skin was scratched, as it were, with fine wrinkles and cross furrows that appeared in the long, fairly arched neck. Yet he seemed full young amongst the others there, though he was in no wise the youngest man in the room. 'Twas that he was slender and lithe as ever, bore his body in the same supple, somewhat careless fashion as in his youth, and walked no less lightly and springily as now, after the treasurer had left him, he began to stroll up and down the room, still with his hands clasped behind him. All the other men were seated. They talked a little among themselves in low, dry voices. Erland's light step and the jingle of his small silver spurs were too clearly heard. At length one of the younger men testily bade him sit down, and be a little quieter, man. Erland stopped short and knit his brows, then turned to the man who had spoken. "Where were you drinking yesterday, kinsman John, that your head is so sore today?" he said with a laugh, sitting down. When Harald Langmand came across to him, he rose, indeed, and stood till the other had sat down. But then he dropped down by the lagman's side, crossed one leg over the other, and sat with his hands clasped over his knee while Harald was speaking. Erland had told Simon frankly of all the trouble he had fallen into by reason of the manslayer and the witchwoman having slipped through his fingers. But no man could have seemed more carefree than Erland as he sat talking the matter over with the lagmand. Now the archbishop entered. He was led to his high seat by two men who propped him up with pillows. Simon had never before seen Lord Eilif Courtin. He looked old and feeble and seemed to be cold, though he was clad in a fur cloak and wore a fur-lined cap. When their turn came, Erland led his brother-in-law up to him, and Simon knelt on one knee while he kissed Lord Eilif's ring. Erland, too, kissed the ring reverently. He bore him most seemly and reverently too, when at last he stood forth before the archbishop, after the churchman had spoken a good while with the others on divers matters. But he answered somewhat lightly the questions one of the canons put to him, and his mien was that of a man confident in his innocence. Yes, he had heard the common talk of witchcraft for many years, but so long as no one had come to him for guidance, surely he could in no wise be bound to search out the truth of all the talk that went on among the womenfolk in the parish. Surely was the priest's affair to make inquiry, if there were grounds for making out a case against anyone. Then he was asked about the old man who had dwelt at Huseby, and who folks said was a wizard. Erland smiled a little. Yes, Arne had bragged of it himself, but no proof of his mystery had Erland ever seen. From his childhood up he had heard Arne talk of some women he called Hain and Skogul and Snotra, but he had never taken all this to be nothing else but toys and nursery tales. My brother Gunnulf and our priest, Sire Eilif, cross-questioned him once or twice, I know, but I think they cannot have found anything against him, since they did nothing. The man came to the church each Mass day and knew his Christian prayers. Great faith in Arne's sorceries he had never had, and since he had seen somewhat in the north of Lap magic and spells, he had seen full well that the magic Arne dealt in was but foolery. Then the priest asked if it was true that Erland himself had once been given a thing by Arne, something that was to bring him fortune in amour. Yes, answered Erland, quickly and clearly, with a smile. It was when he was about 15, he thought, 28 years ago or so. A skin pouch with a little white stone in it, and some dried-up things. Bits of some beast, he believed. But he had not much faith in such things in those days either. He had given it away the next year, the first year he was at the palace. It was in a bathhouse up in the town. In a rash jesting moment he had shown the charm to some other young lads, and afterwards one of the gentlemen of the guard had come to him wanting to buy it. Erland had given it him in barter for a razor of fine steel. It was asked who this gentleman might be. At first Erland would not come out with it, but the archbishop himself bade him speak. Then Erland looked up with a gleam of mischief in his blue eyes. It was Sir Ivar Ogmundsson. There came a somewhat strained look into the men's faces. Strange snorting sounds came from old Sir Guttorm Helgason. Lord Eilif himself had some ado not to smile. Then Erland, growing venturesome, went on, with eyes cast down, and biting his under lip a little. My lord, I trust you will not trouble the good knight with this ancient matter. As I have said to you, I believe not much in the thing myself, and I have never marked that it made any odds to either of us, my giving him this treasure. Sir Guttorm doubled up in a roar, and the other men had to give in one after the other, and laugh aloud. The archbishop tittered a little, coughing and shaking his head. It was well known that Sir Ivar's will had ever been better than his fortune in certain matters. In a while, however, one of the crossed friars grew sober again, and reminded the company they were come together to speak of grave matters. Erland asked a little sharply if a charge had been laid against him from any quarter, and if he were on trial. He had not supposed anything else than that he had been sent for to a friendly conference. The talk then went on as before, but some disorder was caused by Guttorm Helgason bursting out every now and then into little snickers of laughter. The day after, when the brothers-in-law rode home from Ranheim, Simon brought up the matter of this meeting. It seemed to Simon that Erland took the thing over lightly. He thought he had marked clearly that more than one of the great folk there would be fain to do him an ill turn if they could. Erland said he knew well enough they would, if they had the power. For here in the north most men leaned to the Chancellor's party, not the Archbishop, though. In him Erland had a trusty friend. But Erland's dealings in all things were comfortable to the law. He took counsel in all cases with his clerk, Clong Arason, who was most skilful in such matters. Erland spoke gravely now, but he smiled slightly as he said that he thought none of the men had looked that he should be as well skilled in the matters of his charge as he was, neither his dear friends in this countryside, nor the lords of the council. For the rest, he was not sure that he cared to keep the wardenship, if it was to be on other terms than those he had while Erling Vidkundsen was at the helm. His affairs were now in such a state, the more so since his wife's parents' death, that he had no need to bargain for the favour of the men that had come to power when the king was declared of age. Aye, that rotten boy they might just as well call of age now as later. 'Twas unlike he would grow more of a man just by getting older. One would come to know all the sooner what he was planning, he or the Swedish lords that pulled the strings. Folk would soon own that Erling had been clear-sighted after all. It would cost us dear if King Magnus tried to bring Skarn under the Swedish crown, and would mean war with the Danes the moment one man, be he Danish or German, came to power in Denmark. And the peace in the north that was to last 10 years? Half the time was gone by now, and it was unsure whether the Russians would hold to the pact, even for the 5 years left. Erland had little faith in them, nor had Erling either, for that matter. Chancellor Paul was doubtless a learned man, long-headed too in many ways perhaps. But these gentry of the council who had taken him for their leader, his horse Soten had more wit than the whole of them put together. Well, now they had got quit of Erling, for the time. And for the time, too, Erland was just as happy to step aside. But Erling and his friends would doubtless rather that Erland kept a hold on his powers and fortunes in the north here, so he had not made up his mind. "Methinks you have learned now to sing Sir Erling's tune," Simon Dar could not help saying. Erland answered yes, it was so. He had dwelt in Sir Erling's house last summer when he was at Bjorgvin, and he had learned to understand the man better now. So it was that Sir Erling wished above all things to uphold the king's peace in the land. But he wished too that Norway's realm should have the lion's peace, that none should have leave to break a tooth or clip a claw of their kinsman's King Hakon's lion, and that it should not be turned either into a trained hunting dog for the people of another land. For the rest, Erling had it much at heart now to bring an end to the old quarrels between Norsemen and Lady Ingeborg. Now that she had been left a widow by Sir Knut, one could not but wish that she should get some power over her son again. True it was that she bore such exceeding great love to the children she had borne to Knut Pors that it seemed she had in some measure forgotten her eldest son. But doubtless all this would be changed when she came to meet him again. Simon thought that all this sounded as though Erland were well informed of what was afoot, but he wondered at Erling Vidkundsen. Did the fallen high steward believe that Erland Nikolausen had the wit to form a judgment in such things? Or was it that Erling was catching now at any straw within reach? Like enough, the Knight of Gisk was loath to loose his grasp on power. None could ever have said of him that he used it for his own profit, but then, with his riches and his standing, he had no need to do so. And all said that as the years of his stewardship went on, he had grown more and more self-willed and wise in his own conceit. And as the other lords of the council began more and more to withstand him, he had at last grown so masterful that he would scarce deign to listen to a word from any man. It was like Erland that he had now, so to speak, gotten aboard Erling Vidkundsen's ship with both feet, just as it had met with headwinds, and it seemed most unsure whether his throwing himself with all his heart on his rich kinsman's side would profit either Sir Erling or Erland himself. Yet Simon could not but confess to himself that, rashly as Erland talked both of people and of affairs, there seemed to be a kernel of good sense in what he said. But that night he was in a wild and reckless mood. He was dwelling now in Sir Nikolaus's mansion, which his brother had given to Erland when he took the cowl. Kristin was with him, with 3 of their children, the 2 eldest and the youngest, and his daughter Margaret. Late in the evening many folk looked in on them, amongst them some of the men who had been at the meeting at the archbishop's the morning before. As they sat drinking at the board after supper, Erland overflowed with noise and laughter. He had taken an apple from a dish upon the table, and he cut scrolls and scratches on it with his knife, and then rolled it across the board into the lap of Lady Sigrid Undset, who sat opposite him. The lady who sat by Signeva's side wanted to see the apple and snatched at it. The other would not give it up, and the two women pushed and struggled with each other with laughter and little shrieks. But Erland shouted out that Lady Ivor should have an apple all to herself. Before long he had thrown apples to all the women in the company, and there were love runes carved on them all, he said. "You'll be ruined, lad, should you redeem all these pledges," cried out a man. "Then I will let them go unredeemed. 'Tis not the first time I've had to," Erland answered back, and again there was much laughter. But Clong, the Icelander, had looked at one of the apples, and he cried out that they were not runes, but only meaningless scratches. He would show them, he said, how runes should rightly be cut. But Erland cried out he must do no such thing. "For then 'tis like they would bid me lay you by the heels, Clong, and I cannot get on without you." In the midst of all this turmoil, Erland and Kristin's youngest son had come toddling into the hall. Lavrans Erlandsson was a little over 2 years old now, and was as comely a child as one could see, fair and fat, with silky fine yellow curly hair. And so all the women on the outer bench were at once set on getting hold of the child. They passed him from lap to lap and caressed him, not too gently, for they were now all heated and in wild mirth. Kristin, who sat with her husband in the high seat against the wall, begged to have the child brought round to her, and the little one whimpered and tried to come at her, but 'twas of no avail. Of a sudden Erland leapt across the table and took the child, which was shrieking now, because Lady Signiva and Lady Ivor were dragging at him and struggling over him. The father took the boy up in his arms, coaxing him, and as the little one still went on crying, he began hushing and lulling him, walking up and down with him out in the hall in the half-darkness. It seemed now as though Erland had quite forgotten his guests. The child's little bright head lay on his father's shoulder under the man's black hair, and now and then Erland would caress, with lips half opened, the little hand that rested on his breast in front. So he walked up and down till the maid came in that should have looked to the child and put him to bed long before. Some of the guests called out now that Erland should sing for them to dance to. He had such a fine, strong voice. At first he was unwilling, but then he went over to where his young daughter sat on the women's bench. He put his arm round Margaret and drew her out onto the floor. "You must come along then, my Margaret, and dance with your father." A young man came forward and took the maid's hand. "Margaret has promised to dance with me tonight." But Erland lifted his daughter in his arms and set her down on his other side. "Dance with your own wife, Hakon. Never did I dance with others when I was as newly wed as you are." "Ingeborg says she cannot dance tonight, and I have promised Hakon to dance with him, father," said Margaret. Simon Dar had no mind to dance. He stood a while with an old lady looking on. Now and then his glance rested a moment on Kristin. While her serving maids were clearing the board and wiping it dry and bearing in more drink and dishes of walnuts, she stood up at the end of the table. After, she sat down by the fireplace and talked with a priest who was among the guests. In a while Simon sat down beside the two. When they had danced 1 or 2 dances, Erland came over to his wife. "Come and dance with us, Kristin," he said beseechingly, holding out his hand. "I am tired," she said, looking up for an instant. "Simon, you ask her. She cannot deny you a dance." Simon half rose from his seat and reached out his hand, but Kristin shook her head. "Not now, Simon. I am so weary." Erland stood there a little. He looked as though he was sorely vexed at this. Then he went back to Lady Signiva and took her hand in the chain of dancers, while he called out that now Margaret should sing for them. "Who is that is dancing next your stepdaughter?" asked Simon. He thought in his mind that he liked the man's looks but little, though he was a fine manful-looking young fellow with a fresh brown skin, good teeth and shining eyes. But the eyes were set close into the bridge of the nose, and though he had a big strong mouth and chin, his forehead and upper head were narrow. Kristin said 'twas Hakon Eindridsen of Gimsar, grandson of Tor Eindridsen the warden of Galdola county. Hakon had just been wedded to the comely little woman that sat there in Olaf Lagman's lap. Olaf was her godfather. Simon had marked this woman, for she somewhat favoured his first wife, though she was not so fair. As he found out now that there was a distant kinship, he went over and greeted Ingeborg and sat down and talked with her. The ring of dancers broke up in a while. The elders betook them to the drinking board, but the young folks went on singing and disporting themselves out in the hall. Erland came over to the fireplace along with some of the older men, but he still held Lady Suneva's hand and led her with him, as if without thinking. The men sat down near the fire. There was no seat for the lady, but she stood before Erland, eating walnuts, which he cracked for her with his fingers. "An uncourteous man you are, Erland, for sure," she said suddenly. "There you sit, and I have to stand in front of you." "Nay, you sit down too," said Erland, laughing, and pulled her down into his lap. She struggled, laughing, and called out to the mistress of the house, asking if she saw how her husband was behaving to her. "'Tis but the kindness of Erland's heart," answered Kristin. "Never does my cat rub herself against his legs, but he must needs take her up and lay her in his lap." Erland and the lady sat on as before, making no sign, but both had grown very red. He held one arm loosely about her, as if he had hardly marked that she sat there, whilst he and the other men talked of the feud between Erling Vidkudsen and Chancellor Paul, which was so much in folks' thoughts just then. "What are you thinking about, Kristin?" Simon asked in a while. She was sitting quite still and straight, with her hands folded in her lap. She answered, "I was thinking now of Margaret." Later in the night, when Erland and Simon had an errand out in the courtyard, they frighted away from each other a couple that was standing behind the house corner. The night was clear as day, and Simon knew them for Hakon of Gimsar and Margaret Erlandsdatter. Erland looked after them. He was sober enough, and Simon saw that he didn't like this. But he said, as though in excuse, that those two had known each other from childhood and were for ever teasing and jesting with each other. Simon thought that even if there were no other harm, 'twas pity of the young wife Ingeborg. But the day after, when young Hakon came to the house on some errand and asked after Margit, Erland flamed out at him. "My daughter is not Margit to you. And if so be you left your talk unfinished yesterday, you had best keep a while what you have to say to her." Hakon shrugged his shoulders, and, when he left, begged them to greet Margareta from him. The Huseby folk stayed in Nidaros till the thing was over, but Simon felt none too happy or at home among them. Erland was apt to fall into fretful moods when in his townhouse, because Gunnulf had given the hospital, which lay on the other side of the orchard, the right to use some of the houses that opened from the orchard, and also some rights in the garden. Erland had set his mind on buying out these rights. He didn't like to see the sick folk in the garden and in the courtyard. Many of them, indeed, were an ill-favoured sight. And he was fearful lest his children might take some sickness. But he could not come to agreement with the monks who managed the hospital. Then there was Margaret Erlandsdatter. Simon understood that there was much talk about her, and that Kristin was disquieted by it. But the girl's father seemed not to care. It seemed that he felt sure he could guard his own maid, and there was nothing to dread. Yet he named one day to Simon that he thought Clong Arason had a mind to wed his daughter, and he knew not rightly what to do in the matter. He had nothing against the Icelander except that he was the son of a priest, He was loath it should be said of Margaret's children that there was a stain on both their parents' birth. Else, Clong was a man that all liked, cheerful, keen-witted, and most learned. His father, Charles Archer, had brought him up and taught him himself. He had meant his son to be a priest, and 'twas said he had even taken steps to get a dispensation for him. But Clong had drawn back and would not take the frock. It seemed as though Erland was minded to let the matter rest a while. If no better match offered, he could always give the maid to Clong Arison. Yet it was known that Erland had already had such a good offer for his daughter that folk had had much to say of his pride and folly in letting the bargain slip. It was from a grandson of Baron Sigvart of Learhol. Sigmund Finnsson was the man's name. He was not rich, for Finn Sigvardsson had had 11 children, who all lived, and he could not be called young. He was about Erland's age, but he was a man in good esteem and of a good understanding. And with the lands that Erland had given his daughter when he wedded Kristin Lavransdatter, and with all the jewellery and costly gifts he had given the child from time to time, and with the dowry he had agreed with Sigmund to give with her, Margaret would have been more than well-to-do. Erland indeed had been glad enough to find such a suitor for his base-born daughter. But when he came home to his daughter with the bridegroom, the maid took a whimsy that she would not have him because Sigmund had some warts on the edge of one of his eyelids, and she said this gave her such a loathing of him. Erland gave in to the girl, and when Sigmund grew angry and talked of breach of troth, Erland too grew hot and said that the other must surely understand that all betrothal pacts were made on condition that the maid was willing. His daughter would not be forced into her bride-bed. Kristin agreed with her husband in so far as that he should not force the girl, but 'twas known that she had deemed Erland should have spoken in sober sadness to his daughter, and made her understand that Sigmund Finnsson was so good a match as, seeing how things stood with her birth, she could not hope to find a better. But Erland had been wroth with his wife for venturing to speak thus, though she said it to him only. These things Simon had heard at Ranheim. The folk there foretold that all this must end badly. 'Twas true Erland was a man of weight now, and the maid was passing fair, and yet it was impossible it would be for her good that her father had spoiled her all these years and fed the flames of her pride and self-will. After the Froster thing, Erland went home to Huseby with his wife and children, and with them went Simon Dar. Now, when the elder sons were big enough to ride abroad with Erland, he had begun to take more heed of the boys. Simon marked that Kristin was not wholly glad of this. She thought it was not only good that they got by going amongst their father's men, and it was about the children that unfriendly words most often passed between this wedded pair. Even if they did not quarrel outright, they often came more nigh to it than Simon thought fitting, and it seemed to him that Kristin was the most at fault. Erland was quick-tempered and hasty, but she often spoke as though from a deep-hidden grudge. So it was one day when she made some complaint about Narkby. Erland answered that he would speak strictly to the boy, but, on his wife saying something more, he broke out testily, saying he could not well thrash a big boy like him because of the housefolk. "No, 'tis too late now. Had you done it when he was younger, he might have listened to you now. But in those days you never so much as looked his way." "Oh, but I did. Though it was but reason surely I should let him go about with you when he was little, and 'tis no work for a man, I think, to beat little breechless brats." "You didn't think so last week," said Kristin scornfully and bitterly. Erland made no answer, but rose to his feet and went out. And to Simon this seemed an ill speech of Erland's wife. She was recalling a thing that had befallen the week before. As Erland and Simon came riding into the yard, little Lavrans had come running towards them with a wooden sword, and as he ran by his father's horse, he struck it in mischievous play on the leg with his sword. The horse reared, and the next moment the boy had fallen to the ground beneath its feet. Erland jerked back and flung the horse to one side, then leapt down, throwing the reins to Simon. His face was white with fear when he lifted the boy up in his arms. But when he saw that the child was quite unhurt, he laid him over his left arm, took the wooden sword, and thrashed him with it on the bare bottom. The boy had not been breeched yet. In his worry and fear he knew not how hard he struck, and Lavrans was still going about black and blue. But since then Erland had tried all the time to make friends again with the boy, while the little man sulked, held on to his mother's skirts, and threatened and slapped at his father. And when Lavrans had been put to rest in the evening in his parents' bed, where he slept, for he was still nursed by his mother at night, Erland sat over on the bedside the whole evening, looking down on the sleeping child and touching him. He said himself to Simon that this boy was the one of his sons that he loved best. When Erland set forth for the summer meetings in his charge, Simon took the road for home. He galloped south through Galdal, so that the sparks flew from the stones under his horse's hoofs. Once, when they rode a little slower up a steep hill, his men asked, laughing, whether they were to ride 3 days' march in 2. Simon laughed back and said he had more than a mind that they should, for now I am fain to be back at Formo. He ever longed to be back when he had been away from his manor a while. He was a home-loving man, and rejoiced always when he turned his horse into the homeward road. But it seemed to him that this time he had never before yearned so much to get back to the dale and his manor and his little daughters. And now he longed for Ramborg too. It seemed to him that he had no good reason for this great eagerness, but the life at Huseby had so weighed upon his mood that he thought he knew now from himself how cattle feel when a storm is coming.